Welcome back, everybody. So in the last two videos, we set up the Firebase auth service as well as the mock auth service. We abstracted both of those away to a protocol called auth service that we injected into the environment through the entry macro using the environment values. When we first created the Firebase auth service, we talked about using a struct or a class. And we went with struct. Struct allowed us to use the environment values. If we went with class, we were going to have to make an observable object. And we talked a little bit about how those differ. But because we went with struct, we are now limited to not having an instance for this service. So an instance, meaning a class, would be useful if we needed to keep something in memory for our user's authentication. So right now, thankfully, Firebase SDK allows us to synchronously call current user, and we can get the user's ID. But every time we do this, we're actually pinging the Firebase SDK and fetching the user ID again. So the question would be, what if I wanted to keep the user ID or the user in memory somewhere in my app? What if I wanted to hold a local version of this user ID? Well, when I call authenticated user, I could, so we have the user here, maybe we could put a @state private var maybe current user of type user auth info. So we could just set in this view the current user equal to the user, for example, right? But now this value is not going to be shared across my whole application. So then I need to put in some extra work to now share the current user across the whole application. So I could do that. I can put this state as another environment value into the environment. But really, I want my authentication service to hold in memory the current user's ID. Because in the abstract, I want to put all of the code that is managing my authentication in one file. I don't want to have an auth service and also have another auth user floating around the environment and then maybe even something else. Secondly, there's a situation here where in the Firebase docs, there's actually something called the add state did change listener. So we can listen in real time to the user's authentication changing. So we can add a listener and then get the current user back. But adding a listener gives us the exact same problem. We need to hold a reference to that listener somewhere. And so if I were to use this Firebase auth service, because it's a struct, right, we don't have that instance, we don't have a place where we can actually hold a reference to that listener. So we would have to then go and in some view, we would pull from the Firebase auth service, get that listener, and have the view then in charge of storing that listener in our code base. And we could do that, but I would prefer to bundle up all of that user authentication logic into one file. So if I look at our architecture quick, if this is my architecture, I'll fetch the data from the service, bring it into my screen, and then I'll have to store the authenticated user either in a view somewhere, or I'll put it into the environment into another class that would be separate from these auth services, right? And the problem with this approach is that now, whether or not I hold that user in a view or in a separate class, this is separate from my service. So now I have two different locations in my code base that have sources of truth for my authenticated user. And you could imagine if this class was in the environment and this service was in the environment, now I have two sources of truth. Maybe at some point they get out of sync and now I have bugs across my app. So what we actually want to do is create a class, which I will call a manager. And we want the services to point to our data manager. And then our data manager is going to point into our application. So this way we can still use these services that we're set up, except now we can hold data in memory through a manager class here. And there's only one point of reference that the entire application can reference. So all of these views can now access the manager and get whatever we stored in memory. If that makes sense, so this is just going to be essentially an observable object that holds in memory some data for these services. Let's go ahead and build that now. I'm going to jump into the code base. In our auth section, we're going to right click and create a new empty file. Let's call this the AuthManager. And in here, obviously, we know this is going to be a class. So we'll call this AuthManager. This is a class because we need that instance so we can hold some data. The main piece of data that we're going to hold, which I'll make a private, we'll do private set, a variable called the user's auth, and it'll be of type user auth info. So when we load up our application, we'll get the user's auth in memory here, and now we can access this directly from all of our views. Because I want to access this from my view, we know that our views run on the main thread. So in order for this to be accessible from the view directly, this must also be on the main actor. So here I will mark this as main actor, this class. And then secondly, we know that when we go to our app view, we talked about 2 videos back. The environment, for structs we use the environment values, for classes we use the observable and any object. So we now know that we're using a class, so we're going to have to go and make this an @observable. We use the observable macro. Let's go ahead and import SwiftUI. Now just like in our diagram, our manager is going to need a service. And obviously it's not going to be both, it's going to be one or the other, either the mock service or the Firebase auth service. So in here, let's go ahead and inject, we'll initialize this with some sort of service. We'll call this our auth service. So when we build out our auth manager, we're not going to care which auth service it is. We're just going to use the protocol here. So this way we can do an auth manager with the mock or with Firebase. Let's store a reference to our service in here. So we'll say private let service of type auth service. In here, I'll set self.service equal to the service that we passed in. And now this auth manager is going to be the only method that we access from our code. So if I go back to our auth service here, we're no longer going to put the auth service into the environment. Instead, we're going to put our auth manager into the environment. Again, just looking at our diagram here, the environment accesses this directly. The environment no longer accesses this directly. So let's go ahead and delete the macro. So we'll delete this. If I build the app now, we should get a couple compiler errors because SwiftUI will have no idea where any of that auth service stuff is coming from. Let's jump to our environment builder view. So we created, at the root of our application, we wrapped our app into this builder view. So we added into the environment the auth service. And now instead we actually just want to add into the environment object here. So here, this is our Firebase implementation. So here we'll initialize an auth manager and we'll add in our Firebase auth service into the auth manager. Let's go ahead and click delete here. So now because of this, we need to access the auth manager in all of our views. So if I look at my views here, I have this code. This code is now going to change to @environment. Using the observable protocol, we can call AuthManager.self private var AuthManager. So this I will copy and Command Shift F, and let's go find and replace. Let's replace this with this, and I will make this, I'll click the little A up here so that it is case sensitive. Let's find all of them. There's 3 in our code. Let's replace all of them. You can see that it worked here. And then secondly, in all of our code, we have this auth service that we are accessing. So auth service is now auth manager. So I'm going to come here, let's paste in auth service dot, and let's also change that to auth manager dot. Let's find all of them and replace all of them. So now my code should look closer to this, auth manager dot sign in Apple. I will go ahead and build and run. All right. Last but not least, obviously our auth manager doesn't have these methods. So let's go into our auth manager. Or actually, let's go into our service. I'm going to copy these methods and just paste it here. All right. Now our auth manager could also conform to auth service, but I'm actually not going to do that on purpose. In case we want to do something different in our auth manager, it does not need to conform to this service protocol. It's just the dependency itself needs to conform to this service. The AuthManager does not. So for example, the AuthManager has a auth that is stored in memory, right? This is not part of our auth service. So if we were to conform to auth service and then we use only the auth service in our code, we wouldn't have access to this. So the AuthManager just doesn't need to conform to the protocol as well, but we do need to access all of these methods. So what I'm going to do is create functions in here for each of these. Let's go ahead and make this a function. Let's make this a function. And for our purposes, I'm keeping the syntax the exact same. But now we do have the ability to change the syntax in the manager if we want to. So our dependency, creating the dependency, could have different syntax from the manager state. And I'll go ahead and not delete this. All right, so now let's start setting this up. And actually, we are going to change a little bit of the syntax. So we don't need to call getAuthenticateDuser anymore from our actual views. From now on, our views can just access the auth directly. So when we create an AuthManager, let's first say self.auth, and we'll set it equal to the service.getAuthenticateDuser. So on launch, as soon as we launch, we will then go and set up what this value is here. So our view can just access this directly. We don't need this function. I do want to add one convenience function though. I'll say func getAuthID, which is a function that throws and returns a string. So in my code base, when I access this auth, because this is optional, when I go to get the user ID, I would have to do like an if let statement every single time. So the code for my view would look like if let UID equals AuthManager dot auth dot UID. And I have to do this if let every time. But when we go and we work with async await, we're almost always in a do catch statement. So it's actually easier to just make this throws so that the code is a little bit more seamless. So we're just going to make a throwing version to get the user ID. So in here, let's just do guard let UID equals auth.uid. Else, let's go ahead and create an enum called auth error. Not to be confused with the Firebase auth error, but this one will say case not signed in. So there is no user ID. Let's go ahead and throw auth error dot not signed in, and if there is one, we'll go ahead and return the UID. Let's make this conform to localized error. I will add the auth error at the bottom of the file just because it's not very relevant. Sign in anonymously, we need to now call the service. So we'll say try await service dot sign in anonymously. Down here we'll call try await service dot sign in apple. Here we'll call service dot sign out and service dot delete account. This is a try, and if sign out is successful, let's make sure that we remember to set our auth equal to nil, our local version that we are managing in memory. Same with the delete account. So here we're going to try await and then set auth back equal to nil. And lastly, as I was talking about earlier, Firebase has that auth listener. So there is this add state did change listener. Let's go ahead and get one of those. So our Firebase code we know is in our Firebase auth service. Let's create a function up here and it will do something. And let's try to access it. So we'll say let listener equals auth.auth .add state did change listener. We'll click enter here. This is the auth, but we really are looking for the current user. So this will be the current user. It's the current user profile. So we have a listener and we get back the current user. And let's quickly convert this code into async stream. I will post a video below on how to use async stream. I did a video on YouTube about it, but we'll call async stream. We'll look for the continuation here. This will be the continuation. And then this function will return us the async stream. Async stream has a generic type, which will make the user auth info. Make it optional in case there is none. So this code will now go inside our async stream. And then every time we get the current user, so every time the listener does change, we'll say here, if let user equals current user. So if we get one, we'll say if let current user. So if there is one, let's say let user equals the user auth info. So our version of the current user. And we'll call the continuation dot yield. And we'll send back the user. Else, we'll do continuation dot yield. And we'll send back the nil value. So this should listen in real time and then either send back this or send back this. This listener, we now need to store a reference to this listener. So when we call do something, let's send back in the closure the listener. We'll just say on listener attached, and it'll be a function that returns void. But this function in here will accept the listener, any NS object protocol. All right, I guess any NS object protocol. Let's go ahead and call our closure here for on listener attached. And we'll pass in the listener. Cool. This code is a little difficult. Let's notice that this closure is going to execute as soon as we create the async stream. So this closure where we create the listener and on listener attach executes basically immediately, the first launch. But this closure is going to execute every time this state does change. So this will run maybe a bunch of times throughout my application, but this should only run one time. Let's change this function to be called add authenticated user listener. And now let's just make this part of our protocol. So I'll copy this. Let's jump to auth service and we'll paste this in here. If I build and run, we should get a compiler error because the mock AuthManager does not have this yet. Let's jump to the mock AuthManager, mock auth service. Let's add this function in. And for right now, I'm just going to create a async stream, continuation. Let's just call it once, continuation, and we'll .yield, and we'll call the current user whatever we passed in at the beginning. We're going to update this to be actually updatable in real time for our mock later in the course. Let's go back now to our AuthManager. And let's create one more function. This will be a private func, so we'll only access it from within this class. And we'll say add auth listener. Let's create a task, and we'll say for await value in service dot add authenticated listener. This, we'll click enter. This will be our listener that we get back. And then this closure. So if we didn't have this closure here, it would look like this. But we have to add this closure back in here. So it looks a little bit more complicated, but we'll do a private var listener of type any NS object protocol. We'll set the listener self.listener equal to the listener that's returned. Let's fix this. And then in here, we'll now get these values streaming back. So now we can set the self.auth equal to the value in real time. In here, let's call add auth listener as soon as we launch the application. For now, let's add a print statement that just says auth listener success, and we'll just print out the value.uid. Otherwise, no UID. Let's go ahead and build it to a simulator, see if we get this to work at all. In our settings view, we have the environment, which we will now change to the .environment object, AuthManager. Let's copy our service from here. I'll copy this, paste it here, change this service to this service, copy it one more time, change this service to this service, and build and run it one more time. Let's see if our auth listener is working. AuthManager no longer has get authenticated user, so now we should be able to call AuthManager.auth, our value in memory, and that is a little bit better. One more error, same error here. If let AuthManager.auth, build it one more time, and now we should be able to tell if our auth listener is working. See what prints out. User already authenticated, add auth listener, and the auth listener also gave us back the same UID, so that looks like it is working. Let's go ahead and sign in and sign out and just make sure that this listener is accurate as we switch accounts. So let's go ahead and let's sign out. When we signed out, auth listener updated to no UID, and then we created our anonymous user ID and the auth listener updated as well. So in real time now we're keeping this auth updated as we move around our application. And because we have one auth listener that is in our entire application, we don't ever have to worry about removing this listener, because we'll use this one across our whole app rather than putting a listener on each screen. Awesome. That is all for this video, and we now have our AuthManager set up. So just to remind you guys, this is how our architecture appears now. So we have the service through the manager, which is then accessible to the environment. And we're going to use this setup a lot as we move forward, because basically every dependency that we add going forward, we're going to have the same problem. We're going to start with some struct, we're going to run into an issue where we want to hold something in memory, and then we'll realize that having an instance of the class will give us a little bit more flexibility in our code. So in some ways it is risk adverse to set it up like this from the start, because we know that we'll get the benefits of using the sendable service, but we'll also be able to store something in memory if we want to. All right, that's all from this video. Thank you all for watching. Option Command C. Let's call this a feature, and we'll go ahead and call this the AuthManager. Stage it and commit it. Push it up to GitHub, and I'll see you guys in the next video.